Hi guys, my name is Brian. I'm a science teacher, I'm a former medical student, and I'm an opioid and benzo addict of 15 plus years who is currently tapering off of methadone maintenance. It is a 0 stars on Yelp kind of process that I will provide an update video on before too long. But yeah, I run an addiction and recovery blog called the Concrete Confessional blog. And today I'm going to be talking about how to talk to young people about drugs. And when I say that, I want to make it clear that I mean specifically how to listen to them about drugs, because in my view, a lot of the inefficiency or the pointlessness of anti-drug programming comes from talking at and talking past young people rather than just listening to them for the information that we need to help them and to steer them in more constructive and safe directions. So yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the anti-drug programming that I grew up under, which was totally ineffective. I'm going to talk about 3 questions that I wouldn't necessarily ask a young person verbatim, but that I would want to get a sense of the answers to through my discussion with them about why they're interested in or why they're using mind-altering substances. And I'm also going to at the end talk a little bit about some extra thoughts that I have for parents of young people who are possibly using substances, particularly parents who know that there's family risk of addiction, because I get that question all the time on my blog, and I've thought a lot about it because of that. I have huge addictive presence in both sides of my family too. So for those of you who don't know the extent of things right now, it's really bad for young people, particularly in the US. It's not just confined to addiction, although addiction has become the leading cause of death in the US for people under age 50, which is so bad I literally don't have words for it. But even outside of addiction, our young people are struggling with anxiety and depression at unprecedented levels. It really kicked off during the pandemic. That's when it seemed to reach this new peak, but it hasn't subsided too much since then. And so we've got, as I said, critical levels of anxiety and depression and mental health crises. We've got young people telling us like they are not okay, and we're not sure quite what to do about it. And because of that, we've got a lot of deaths of despair and a lot of worrying trends in the Zoomers and even people a little bit older than them. So first thing that I want to talk about again is the anti-drug programming that I grew up under. So it was called D.A.R.E. It was called Drug Abuse Resistance Education, I think is the acronym. And it was okay for its time. You know, I was growing up in the 90s and aughts. So what it usually involved was typically they would have some guest speakers. Sometimes they would have like a Mothers Against Drunk Driving speaker, or we had a former professional football player named Dan Davis who became addicted to cocaine come in and give an assembly for our school. But mainly like the week-to-week programming was a police officer coming into your school and telling you these are the different classes of addictive drugs out there. It was only talking about illegal substances, and they were saying, okay, this is what this class of substance looks like, this is what it does, and this is why you shouldn't do it. Okay, so the sort of underlying philosophy seemed to be, we'll tell them what's out there, and we'll talk to them about peer pressure and social effects, and once they have the information about how dangerous these drugs can be, well, they'll make the logical decision. Turned out that that was a totally wrong and misinformed, misdirected response. So young people, if you've ever spent time with an angsty teenager, you know they are not rational actors. It takes an adult brain to be able to rein in the impulsivity. It's part of adolescence in particular, right? So just having the information isn't good enough. So that was fault one of the D.A.R.E. programming, in my opinion, was people when they're at the ages that D.A.R.E. was interacting with them at, they're not rational actors, okay? The other thing, the other big problem with that is that it divorced talk about substance use from wider mental health topics. So the presumption seemed to be like, basically the pattern of addiction is you're a young person, you start out of curiosity and peer pressure, you start out with experimentation, eventually that experimentation gets out of hand and the reinforcing effect of these drugs sets in, and then you're in too deep and you can't get out. So that was the model, and it turns out that that's an absolutely terrible, inaccurate model of how addiction develops. So that was the other thing about it, was that the underlying model didn't fit reality, and because of that it was a pretty pointless intervention. And the reason that that was the case is that addiction comes hugely from substance use motivated by trying to deal with problems, psychological problems, problems in family and community. So there was no talk at all in D.A.R.E, like I mean none, about anxiety, depression, about loss, pressure, failure, loneliness, community, purpose, spirituality, shame. In the 90s and aughts, our country was going through not times that were as tough as what we have now, but some really soul-searching times when we realized that things weren't as good as they had been for a while, that we were on sort of a downward trajectory, and that created all kinds of social stress. It created all kinds of disruptions in the social fabric, and D.A.R.E just sort of lasered in on addiction and substance use as though it was something that could be addressed in its own right, in isolation, and that is completely false in why it was so ineffective. So they never, ever, ever considered in this D.A.R.E programming, like, you might be using, say, weed or benzos or whatever because you're so anxious, you need to get out of your baseline physiology. It's so uncomfortable, you're willing to take on almost any risk just to get a break from it. I talk a lot on my blog about how I feel almost predestined to become an addict because it was the way that I was naturally what felt so wrong to me. It felt so unbearable that the first time I tried these addictive anxiolytic drugs like benzos and opioids, I didn't feel messed up. I felt home. I felt like, oh my God, like I can finally do this. Like I felt right. I felt more social. I felt calmer. Like other people would comment on how good I seemed after I took these drugs. So one of the big problems with D.A.R.E, which I'm getting at again, is that it tried to take addiction and deal with it as though it was just an out of control partying problem, and that's completely false. And until you address like what people are running and seeking refuge from in substances, like the other psychological problems they have, the problems with community and family that are plaguing our country, you're not going to be able to really help them, because in the beginning at least, drugs are an incredibly logical, effective way to cope with certain problems. When I say that benzos and opioids took care of my anxiety, I mean for years I was functioning at the highest level. I graduated second in my class in high school. I went to an Ivy League university. I graduated from the Ivy League university on track for medical school with a 3.75 magna cum laude GPA. Like during all of that time, I was using benzos and opioids because they were helping me, because they made me feel like that level of achievement was possible and I wasn't burning out, and it made life better. So in the end, those substances ruined my life. In the end, I had to pay all of those accrued, penalties for taking the easy way out chemically with interest. But I didn't know that as a young person. I say it all the time, but until you're 25, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that evaluates risk and allows you to make long-term plans, that isn't fully developed. So young people are literally neurobiologically, structurally unable to take risk into account properly. And I see that in my own life hugely. So that's another thing that we got to keep in mind with anti-drug programming, is we're not necessarily dealing with rational actors. And again, the problem with D.A.R.E was it took addiction and separated it from wider mental health conversation. They never once taught us a breathing exercise. They never taught us, this is how you use cognitive behavioral therapy techniques to avoid unhelpful globalization or catastrophization in your thinking. This is how you use CBT to shift your thinking in a more positive direction, or this is how you use DBT to be present in the moment. Now, those would have been concrete skills that people could use instead of drugs, so that when you tell them not to use drugs, you're not just leaving a psychological vacuum, which is not helpful, but we didn't get into that at all. So again, you got to address what people are seeking refuge from in using mind-altering chemicals, as much as you've got to deal with sort of the connection of addiction with other mental health struggles, family struggles, social struggles. Okay, the other thing I wanted to mention is really crucially, we didn't talk at all in D.A.R.E about addictive chemicals. Now, the biggest killer, the record-breaking killer of my generation were opioids, okay? There were, at the height of the opioid epidemic in the US, we have overflow body storage facilities, places, morgues that are meant to be used like in the case of an airplane crash or a huge fire, another mass casualty event. We had those filled with the bodies of addicts. And this all started with prescription OxyContin from Purdue. No one in D.A.R.E told us that the most addictive drug we could ever use was probably in our parents' medicine cabinet. They certainly didn't tell our parents that. They didn't tell them that when we were getting Vicodin, when our wisdom teeth were removed, which now we know is totally medically inadvisable, that could jumpstart an addiction. They also didn't tell us that Adderall, prescribed widely for ADHD, was just amphetamine salts, that it can be incredibly addictive, that it's not more effective than an active placebo, like a good diet and karate. Okay, so the other big problem with D.A.R.E is it didn't address the prescription drug component. And again, that was the single biggest entry point to severe addiction in my generation. More people are dead who started out on prescription oxy than anything else in my generation and the one who came before. So the focus on street drugs was yet another problem. So I just want to introduce D.A.R.E again to show you like what doesn't work from my perspective, to sort of frame this discussion that I'm going to get into now of, okay, what do I think will work? Okay, and again, I'm talking about sort of how would I talk to a younger person about addiction. And when a colleague asked me that, a colleague who is one of the rare people I talk to about having a background with addiction, when she asked me this one day, I had to really think about it, because my first response was, if I knew a young person was using, say, opioids, I would be so panicked. I would be so, I would want to shock them out of it, because I can't tell you, I wouldn't wish what I've been through in addiction on a friggin' maggot. Like, it's that bad. So, like, I would want to tell them, like, what exactly it feels like the graphic lows of being physically addicted to benzos and opioids, which turn your body into a horror movie, you know? I would want to talk about the humiliating things that I've done on those days when I was desperate for money and sick enough to do anything. I want to talk about the loss of dignity and how when you look at yourself in the mirror, when you can no longer keep a promise to yourself or to the people that you love most, you know, it's hard to want to keep living once you've gotten down that low. Your dignity leaves you. So my first impulse when my colleague asked me this was like, let me see if I can shock them out of it. And I think that telling them about just how low things can get can play a role in the conversation with young people, but it can't be like the primary tactic. There's this interview, and I don't know anything about his music, but there's this interview with Marilyn Manson where I think the question was about how the Columbine killers apparently, or at the time, they thought they had listened to Marilyn Manson's music, and they asked him, like, so what would you say to them if you knew that these teens who committed this horrific shooting had listened to your music? And Marilyn Manson said something that really stuck with me. He said, you know, basically, I wouldn't tell them anything. I would listen. And so that's the second response I had to this inquiry by my colleague, was like, it's really not so much about talking at them or even with them. It's about listening to them. So now I'm going to go into 3 questions. Again, I wouldn't say these verbatim because it would be kind of a stilted, awkward conversation, but these would be the questions that I was trying to get at through my conversation with them about why they're thinking of or actually using mind-altering substances. So the first question that I would want to know the answer to is, what are you hoping to achieve in using these mind-altering substances? So I can see, as I mentioned before, when I was growing up, I was really uncomfortable in my body. I had a lot of dissociative symptoms. I had a really high level of internal tension, really high achievement, but with that perfectionism and being really harsh on myself, I didn't like how I looked and sounded, and I had just super high anxiety. So really early on, I got interested in alternative states, or altered states, I should say, without even really knowing what I was about. I got into yoga, which no one in my tiny Catholic town was into. Like I learned this yoga position where I'm basically supporting my legs are crossed and I'm supporting myself on my palms. You know, I got really into like manipulating my body as a way to manipulate my mind. I got really into Gnostic Christianity, like transcendental or non-apocryphal Christianity, which is more like sort of talking directly to God, and it's more about the kingdom of heaven as maybe a metaphor for a state that we might be able to achieve here on earth through good works and through meditation. Got really into the occult, the magical end of things, and I got really into distance running. And to this day, I say it's tough for me to meditate, it's tough for me to be mindful, but when I'm running 6 or 8 miles and my breathing is just on my 4-beat stride with in, out as my breath synchronization, like that's when I get closest to true peace. I have to be moving pretty fast for me to get into a meditative state most of the time, but like it is there for me. So I was trying to achieve some kind of alternative physiology without even really realizing it and getting interested in all of those things. But when I got into substances initially, was mainly about sort of opening the, as Huxley called them, the doors of perception. I was seeking adventure, insight. I was seeking camaraderie. Like I wanted those perceptual sort of, I call them perceptual fireworks from taking acid or mushrooms. I wanted to see the world in a new, beautiful way. I wanted to sort of distort my thinking and see what new insights arrived. So that was kind of where it started for me. And that was fairly harmless, okay? But where it got really dark really quickly is when I started using these depressant, anxiolytic depressant drugs. So I guess I said depressant twice, but anxiolytic depressant drugs like benzos, opioids, alcohol, when I was using those, it came from a much darker place of like, just give me some relief. I am so uncomfortable in my own skin. The only time that I felt like sort of calm and at peace with myself and my body was when I was on those substances. So in asking that first question, what are you hoping to achieve in using mind-altering substances? I would hope to get the younger person to start thinking about what healthy use of substances might look like, whether there's any role for that in their life, versus what very problematic substance use is likely to look like, the kind of substance use that can very quickly turn into addiction, and the kind of substance use that can quickly become a secret that you can't talk to about anyone else. I would want to plant that distinction in their minds, whether it was obviously addressed or not, or explicitly addressed or not, I should say. I would also want to get them thinking about how else can they achieve that, right? If you want an altered state of mind because your natural physiology feels rough to you, like that is totally acceptable. That, there are healthy ways to do that. I mentioned some of them earlier. Yoga, sort of extreme athletic exercise. There are all kinds of ways of manipulating your mind and body to get you to somewhere different from where you begin. And what's awesome is that those don't become addictive for the most part. Like you can use those lifelong with very few risks or negative consequences. So like I would want to get the young person I was talking to thinking about, okay, we've got a goal, we've got something that we want to work on, and how can we achieve that without using potentially dangerous substances? And in particular with this first question, I would want to try to get them making the distinction between drugs like, say, LSD and mushrooms that aren't physically or psychologically addictive, and drugs like opioids, benzos, alcohol, even drug addictive stimulants like amphetamines and cocaine that can lead to very severe physical and psychological addiction. Okay, so that would be question 1. What are you trying to achieve with this? And question 2 would be, when is it going to be enough? So we know, or we think we know why you're using this substance. Even a very young person can appreciate it is, to have a shortcut to bliss is an incredibly dangerous thing. Once you've got the hack for feeling better than you ever thought it was possible to feel, particularly if you're a young person who hasn't spent much of your life feeling good or better than good, it's really tough not to come to rely on that shortcut, okay? So question 2 would be, when is it going to be enough? One of the huge problems with addiction, particularly to physically and more so physically addictive drugs, is that until the substance really has its claws far into you, which can take years, there doesn't often seem to be a very good reason for stopping. Again, for the first few years, you don't often experience a lot of the very negative effects that would motivate you to change. Because of that, it's very likely and very easy to be sort of to succumb to denial, to tell yourself, I can stop at any point, to tell yourself, I'm using this because it works for me and I don't want to stop using it, even though the addictive thing is to tell yourself, I could stop any day if I wanted to, you know? So with the second question about when is it going to be enough, what I would try to do is get the person to start setting internal hard limits. So is once a month good enough if you're using something as dangerous as opioids or benzos or even alcohol? Is once a week enough? If they tell me they're using it weekly or more frequently than that, I'm going to talk to them immediately about how quickly that can get out of control physiologically, how quickly the decision to stop can be taken away from you when you get into this really reinforcing, almost obsessive compulsive disorder like addictive behavior. So I'm going to try to get them to set some reasonable boundaries around their substance use. Certain drugs they're never going to use, frequencies of use that are reasonable, that will probably not lead to physical or even severe psychological addiction. And the reason I'm doing that is not necessarily that I think that it's going to stop the people with a really strong addictive predisposition from becoming addicted. What I do think is that it's going to make them realize that they're going on that path earlier than they would otherwise, and hopefully reach out for help because of that. Okay, so my hope is that it would mitigate denial, make them realize I'm in over my head and I need some help earlier on rather than later in their substance use. Now, this third question, which makes me a little bit emotional to talk about, is why aren't you worth it? So I shot up heroin for the first time when I was 15. Now, there were all kinds of things going on in my life that distorted my emotions. You know, there were some factors that I have no doubt were genetic that made me really desperate to escape my baseline physiology. I ended up later on in life being diagnosed with an autoimmune hyperthyroidism called Graves' disease, which causes it almost causes like a mania. It causes this really high, really physical anxiety. It causes insomnia. So when I look back now, I can see that I was starting to have symptoms of Graves' disease much earlier in life than I was diagnosed, and I can see how those drove me into using depressant drugs. There was also a lot of shame I had over my sexuality, which for a long time I wouldn't even talk about because I felt pretty privileged in that I wasn't like awfully bullied and that my family didn't throw me out, but I was raised in a conservative Catholic town, and what I heard about gay people growing up took a huge toll on me, period, and not admitting it to myself and not talking about it with anyone, it hurt me even worse. So anyway, there were things that drove me to that, but when I look back now and I think of this beautiful 15-year-old boy with so much potential shooting up heroin, yes, I was doing it with older friends and family members who I trusted, but like I should have been scared breathless from that. And the fact that I wasn't, like, I just keep coming back to, yes, I had a young brain. Yes, young male brains in particular have trouble gauging risk and internalizing risk. But like still, like, I just want to know, like, why didn't you love yourself enough? Like, I know I had unconditional love from particularly my grandmas, from my parents on a certain level. Like, why wasn't I worth enough that I shouldn't have taken that risk, that I should have said, like, hell no, I'm not touching anything that dangerous. You know, something that even if it doesn't kill me today is likely to completely ruin my life. And I still don't have a fully satisfactory answer for why I didn't have that in me to say no on the basis of that. But all I can say again is I had really low self-worth. And with this third question, like, why aren't you worth it? I would hope to get a young person thinking about, like, you know, their self-worth. And I know you can't sort of like shock someone, even if you get them to realize, like, wow, I don't love myself enough. You can't shock them into not taking those kind of risks. You know, our self-worth, it comes in part from the people around us. And if you don't have a strong supportive network of people, if you're in a really unhealthy, stressful environment, it can be really tough to access that self-worth. But what I would hope is that even having that conversation with a young person would identify me as a safe place where they could open up, where they could tell me about why they feel so desperate to escape their state of mind and their circumstances through substance use. I would hope that it would let me put them in touch with mentors who would be able to, to shift them in a more positive direction, to get them excited about the future, to get them excited about themselves and who they are. I would hope that I could get them interested enough in doing something constructive with their life that, rather than just say no, it would be say yes to having a life of purpose, of productive, beautiful relationships and responsibilities, of having a life that's good enough that the risks of substances aren't worth it anymore. So with that final conversation, I would try to get them to drop the mask that I had. Again, I was a very high achieving young person. Very early on, being gay taught me how to have these two different selves. Like, one was my private suffering self, and one was my public self, who learned very on that weakness, particularly in American society, which can be, I'm sorry, I love our country, but it can be a society of sore winners, So my early self learned achievements, being good at things, being strong, gets you social recognition and praise. Talking about struggling, being overtly emotional, particularly as a boy, and talking about struggling, those get you laughed at. Those get you sort of sidelined. So I learned how to have two separate selves. And with this third question about why aren't you worth it, when I'm talking to a young person, I would try to break down that mask. Addiction is a disease of lying to ourselves and lying to other people. So a question like this, a question that almost like a shadow work question that really cuts to the core of why is it okay for you to take these risks? Like with most addicts, if you ask them if it's acceptable for another person to hurt themselves the way that the addict is, the addict would say, like, absolutely not. Like, anyone deserves better than that. So the purpose of this third question about why aren't you worth it would be to try to break down that barrier a little bit, to try to get an honest conversation opened up about why aren't you worth more than that. So again, those are the three questions that would be sort of at the front burner of my mind while I was having a conversation with young people about mind-altering substance use. One of the sort of practical things, so I was thinking about what would a more effective D.A.R.E program actually look like? And what I kept coming back to was it would have to be small group, it would be discussion. Again, D.A.R.E was just pretty much presentations. It would have to be a small group discussion focus, so maybe a group of 5 to 8 students who met regularly for each year of high school, or maybe for the first or every other year of high school. Maybe they would meet weekly. Again, it would be something about mental health in general. It would teach them how to access therapy and other mental health resources, where to go when they're in crisis. It would teach them about the different types of therapy, like CBT and DBT and REBT and EMDR for trauma. It would teach them what's out there if you need help. It would, teach them and provide help with if they have to approach their parents about this, in enlisting the parents in the effort of improving their mental health. It would talk to them about what are some practical things we could do. Maybe it would have a yoga class component or some kind of mindfulness component to actually give them at least one concrete skill for when they're crawling out of their skin with adolescent hormones and pressure, so that they can just kind of like take a breath and not get into a state where they're going to be feeling desperate enough for relief that they take regrettable risks and make unfortunate decisions. So it would be something like that. And these groups would be facilitated by people with mental health training. There would be a component of talking to people with mental health diagnoses, including addiction. There would be a component of just sort of identifying personal risk and to coming up with a life plan, again, that is positive enough that they don't want to let substance use get in the way of the big yes, by which I mean what they're going to do with their life. We know that just say no, that Nancy Reagan BS simply doesn't work. You got to show people what they're saying yes to. Again, I always say, what's the big yes that goes along with the little no? Because as humans, we don't want to deprive ourselves. And in fact, our brains are wired to reward us for, sort of spoiling ourselves in a certain way neurobiologically, because those addictive behaviors like maybe eating really good food, having sex, even more so using substances, they crank up the dopamine because our brain interprets them as behaviors that increase our chance of survival and reproduction. So we're fighting against that. And to fight that tide, we've got to have some really big yeses that make saying no to substances that, after all, can make us feel better than almost anything on earth. We have to make it seem worthwhile to say no, is what I'm getting at here. So that's kind of the framework for how I'm thinking about conversations with young people about substances as I envision them. I also have some general thoughts for parents who have young, maybe early adolescent kids who are in particular concerned because they have had addictive struggles or they have other family members who have. I get that question all the time through the contact form on my blog, and I've thought a lot about it. And what I keep coming back to is mentioned before the British journalist D.A.R.E, who has addiction present in his family, I think alcohol and coke addiction, and he did a phenomenal sort of body of research about the neurobiology, the sort of sociology of addiction, and his tagline is, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection. So what is kryptonite for any addiction is basically a healthy mind and a healthy body. It's a life filled with healthy, positive family relationships, friendships, with a job that gives purpose, with a social role that provides constructive responsibilities to other people. You know, as humans, one of the sort of paradoxes is that the more we help people, the more responsible we are for other people, the more, the better we do for ourselves. So what I keep coming back to is you can't really specifically prevent your kid from going in the direction of addiction. You can only build up an honest and open, honest conversation with them where they can approach you if they're struggling. You can build up a healthy mind and a healthy body. You can make sure that they're involved in, whatever it is, sports, engineering club, band or theater, like whatever gives them joy and gets them connected with their peers. Purpose and passion are the kryptonite of addiction. If you have a strong enough purpose, you can get through anything. Some of the people who get sober from the worst addictions are the ones who end up as crusaders, mental health crusaders, crusaders against poverty and homelessness and other social ills. So strong enough passion and purpose is almost kryptonite to addiction. It is almost incompatible with addiction. Now, having said that, if your kid ends up going in the addictive direction, it's not necessarily because you did something wrong, of course. It's unbelievable how drenched in unhealthy substance use American society is. I mean, I spent time in mainland China, and it is unbelievable how normalized dangerous alcohol and drug use is here relative to there. They really protect their kids in mainland China. It is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful sort of commendable parts of their culture. But without getting too much off on a rant, again, I've known people in rehab who didn't touch drugs until they were in their 30s. I've known people who had some kind of injury who ended up on opioid not maintenance, but opioid pain medication regimes because of something that happened to them that required it for a while and then it got out of control. So you can't always prevent your kid from becoming an addict, but what you can do is tell them that you'll walk through the fire with them. What you can do is let them know that they are unconditionally loved and that whatever crap life serves up, you are going to be with them in it and they can come to you with it. You will help them to get help. Not surprisingly, when we study the genetics of addiction, we see that the same people predisposed to addiction, they're predisposed to anxiety, depression. There are some studies I know that show a link between addictive predisposition and bipolar and other mental health diagnoses. So it's not surprising that people really strongly driven toward addictive substance use also struggle with other mental health concerns. But it's important to remember, because just like with any other disease, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And just like if you're preventing cancer, you don't take some super specific intervention that's anti-cancer, right? Instead, we recommend exercise, healthy eating, reducing stress. In the same way, when we're trying to work on preventing addiction, we just work on developing a resilient, sort of robust, motivated, connected psychology. So we work on mindfulness, we work on healthy family relationships, healthy friendships, healthy romantic relationships, how to avoid codependence, how to avoid toxicity of all different types, how to avoid obsessive behaviors and overly self-critical behaviors. So you don't want to worry too much about addiction specifically, even if you've got it in your family. You want to let your kid know, hey, you're at a greater risk of this than your family members. So if you see your friends doing this, it's probably not going to be the same for you. There's a much higher chance that these drugs are going to get their claws in you in a way that they might not in your friends who are maybe trying out this stuff, okay? So again, you're just focused more so with developing a psychologically healthy kid and a kid who you can communicate honestly with, more so than just like, how do I single-mindedly keep them from trying drugs, which probably is not an achievable end point or whatever you want to call it for a lot of American kids in 2025. Having said that, again, watch out for any early prescriptions of things like codeine for cough, okay, of sort of Vicodin, hydrocodone, and drugs like that after the wisdom teeth come out. Now, American dentists almost never offer that anymore. When I was growing up, it was de rigueur. It was totally normal, but watch out for that. Watch out for, if they say your kid has ADHD, for them recommending Adderall, which is just amphetamine salts. It is incredibly addictive, and it's not even effective in the long term. Something like Ritalin, methylphenidate, even some other related compounds that are sort of released more slowly. I'm not saying not to use any of those agents. I'm not a doctor, and I can't make that call. But what I can say is I have seen a truly horrific number of addictions start with that as the entry point. A prescription from a doctor that wasn't abused, that gave the person the taste for what they ended up seeking out later on substance-wise. So beware of those prescriptions, especially early on in life. If you can get your kid to like 18 to 25 without them having gone down the path of addiction, even if they've experimented some, even if they do get into an unhealthy pattern of addictive use later on in their life, they're much more likely to be able to get themselves out of it because they have adult decision-making faculties, because they've developed other coping skills while they were growing up to deal with things like anxiety and depression and stress. So if you can get them to the 18 to 25 benchmark, they've got a much better chance of surviving addiction and of having it be a short episodic thing rather than a lifelong cycle. So those are just some thoughts I would talk to the young person about, giving back, about gratitude and social commitments that involve making the young person think about how good they have it. Again, almost like kryptonite for addiction. Really hard to throw away what you have when you appreciate what you have. And I see that in my own situation. I did community service. I gave back, but my heart wasn't necessarily in it. Like, I was really into the intellectual side of things. I wanted to sort of to sort of take my intelligence and push it as hard as I could against the most difficult material I could find. But that is kind of a selfish pursuit. So I didn't spend enough time. I volunteered at my public library, but I didn't spend enough time seeing how bad people really have it and really having experiences that would allow me to see, like, I am so blessed. I almost don't have the right to throw this away because I have the responsibility to give back to, later in life at least, to these people who have it so much worse off than me. So yeah, wanted to mention that as well. And of course, you want to talk to your kids specifically about substances. You want to ask them, so what are your friends doing? Are they drinking on the weekends? Are they smoking weed? What have you done? And you got to make sure, everyone wants to live in this ideal world where their kid can come to them and have these conversations, but it's incredibly difficult as a parent not to just freak out when they tell you that they're doing something that could kill them, potentially when they're telling you that they could do something that could ruin their life, that could ruin your life. So I get how hard it is, but you got to make yourself into the kind of parent where, my kid came to me and said that they were using opioids. Again, my experience with addiction ruining my life and killing all my friends and family as it has, I would probably tell them, I love you. I'm going to help you with whatever you're going through. I need to talk to you tomorrow, and make sure I had a whole night to sort of coalesce my thoughts. I'm a big fan of written communication, at least to begin with, because I would want to make sure that I was thinking through what I said to them very carefully. Would want to make sure I got maybe help from people who deal with this stuff professionally. But yeah, ask your kids what their peers are doing. If they say nothing, or if they don't know, there's a good chance they're not being honest with you. I would also want to talk to them about therapy being a normal, healthy thing, about how at some point in life, almost all of us need support from some kind find a mental health professional, and that it's better to get it sooner rather than later. That is what a healthy, strong person does. It's not a weakness to get help, it's a strength, because it shows responsibility. It shows that you're trying to limit the impact of something that could potentially make you like disabling anxious or depressed or whatever the case is. The other thing is, especially if your kid has an addictive predisposition based on sort of what yourself and other members of your family have gone through, if you talk to them and at any point they're using any substance, whether it's something that doesn't seem addictive like weed, whether it's alcohol and they're just drinking socially, or whether it's harder than that, if they're using that with any regularity, get them into intensive treatment immediately. If you have addictive predisposition in your family, there is no room for this might be normal teenage stuff. There is no room for let's wait and see. Get them immediately into either intensive outpatient or maybe even inpatient. Like the scales tip in favor of aggressive psychological intervention if you have that background in your family. So that is my final sort of more specific piece of advice, is if you've got their family risk, do not wait, period. Simple as. So I think that that's everything that I wanted to share today. I know that these thoughts are a little bit scattered, but I hope that they are, I know that they're not going to be solutions for anyone in and of themselves, but I hope that they are jumping off points for useful conversations with young people about substances. So coming up in the next few days, I have more content about when, as a partner of an addicted person, you should consider leaving. So please consider sticking around and tuning in next time. So thanks, guys. See you next time.